A pawn shop is where confidence goes to die. Every item here came with hope, with a story, with someone thinking, this has to be worth something. Have you ever kept an object because it felt valuable? Ever thought, someone would totally pay for this? Ever been emotionally attached to something the market wouldn't touch? Because a pawn shop doesn't care why it matters to you, it only cares what it's worth. And these 45 items are what happens when feelings meet cash. Let's step up to the counter. Fact 1. The box of family photos. A middle-aged man walked into a small pawn shop in the Midwest on a quiet weekday afternoon. He wasn't nervous, he was hopeful. He placed a shoebox on the counter and explained that it held old family photographs, some over 50 years old. To him, they were priceless. They carried history, memory, and proof that his family existed long before smartphones did. The pawnshop owner opened the box, flipped through a few photos, then gently closed it again. He didn't ask about the stories. He asked one question. Do you have the negatives? The answer was no. Without negatives, the photos had no resale market, no buyers, no demand. The man looked confused, then quiet. Ask yourself this. Have you ever assumed meaning automatically translates into money? The photos mattered deeply. Unfortunately, pawn shops accept cash value, not emotional inheritance. Fact 2. The rare, decorative sword. A young man entered a pawn shop just outside Las Vegas, carrying a long, decorative sword wrapped in cloth. He was confident. He said it was rare, bought online years ago, and barely used. In his head, rare meant valuable. The sword looked impressive: engraved handle, shiny blade, dramatic weight. The pawn shop owner inspected it carefully, then turned it sideways and tapped the blade. It rang hollow. Stainless steel, mass-produced, sold by the thousands. The owner explained it wasn't functional, wasn't antique, and wasn't collectible. The offer was zero. Ask yourself this. Have you ever trusted a product description more than the market itself? The sword looked important. Unfortunately, pawn shops don't price fantasy. They price what someone else would actually buy. Fact 3. The broken flat-screen TV. A tired woman brought a large flat-screen TV into a neighborhood pawn shop in Florida. She apologized before setting it down and explained, "It just needs one small repair." The TV didn't turn on. The screen flickered once, then died. To her, the value was obvious. It used to work, it was expensive, and fixing it should be easy. The pawn shop owner didn't plug it in again. He simply asked how much a working one sells for online today. The number was lower than the repair cost. The offer was nothing. Ask yourself this. Have you ever counted past value as future value? The TV wasn't useless, it just wasn't worth money anymore. Pawn shops don't invest in potential. They invest in certainty. Fact 4. The box of old college textbooks. A college graduate walked into a pawn shop near a university campus with a box of old textbooks. He explained how much they originally cost and how carefully he kept them. No highlights, no damage. In his mind, that meant resale value. The pawn shop owner checked the editions and publication years. Most were outdated. Some were no longer used at all. Newer versions existed online for cheap or free. The offer was a polite refusal. Ask yourself this. Have you ever assumed expensive once means valuable forever? Knowledge changes. Markets move on. Pawn shops don't buy effort. They buy demand. Fact 5. The engagement ring without papers. A man in his 30s stepped into a pawn shop late in the evening, visibly uncomfortable. He placed an engagement ring on the counter and explained that it was real gold, real diamond, and once meant everything. There were no certificates, no paperwork, no proof. The pawn shop owner tested the metal, examined the stone, and quoted a price far lower than expected. The man argued about what it used to represent. The owner waited quietly. Ask yourself this. Have you ever confused emotional value with market value? The ring was real, the relationship wasn't. Pawn shops don't price promises, they price what can be verified. Fact 6. The childhood trophy collection. A man in his 40s walked into a pawn shop in suburban Ohio carrying a cardboard box. Inside were dozens of childhood trophies: soccer, spelling bees, participation awards. He explained they represented years of effort and dedication. Some even had his name engraved. The pawnshop owner lifted one, turned it over, and noticed the plastic base and stamped metal plate. He asked who would buy someone else's trophies. The man didn't have an answer. There was no offer. Ask yourself this: have you ever assumed effort automatically creates value? The trophies proved achievement. Unfortunately, pawnshops don't buy proof of trying. They buy objects someone else actually wants to own. Fact 7. The designer handbag that wasn't. A woman entered a pawn shop in downtown Los Angeles holding a designer handbag she claimed was authentic. She said it was a gift and barely used. The logo looked right, the stitching looked clean. The pawnshop owner examined the lining, the serial tag, and the hardware. Within seconds, he spotted inconsistencies. It was a convincing fake. The value dropped to zero immediately. Ask yourself this: have you ever trusted branding without verification? The bag looked expensive. Unfortunately, pawnshops don't price appearance. They price authenticity, and authenticity requires proof. Fact 8. The old gaming console with memories. A young man brought an old gaming console into a pawnshop in Texas. He explained how many hours he spent playing it growing up and how well it still worked. To him, nostalgia increased value. The pawnshop owner checked recent resale prices online. Newer models sold cheaper and worked better. The offer was minimal. The man hesitated, surprised. Ask yourself this: have you ever confused nostalgia with demand? The console still functioned. The market just didn't care. Pawnshops don't buy childhoods. They buy what sells today. Fact 9. The signed sports jersey. A sports fan walked into a pawn shop near a stadium carrying a framed jersey signed by a famous athlete. He said it was real and worth a lot online. The pawnshop owner asked for authentication. There was none. Without verified provenance, the autograph was meaningless. The offer was zero. Ask yourself this: have you ever assumed fame transfers value automatically? The jersey looked impressive. Unfortunately, pawnshops don't trust stories. They trust documentation. Fact 10. The box of old smartphones. A man entered a pawn shop in New Jersey with a box of old smartphones. He explained they were expensive when new and still turned on. The pawn shop owner checked models and storage capacity. Most were obsolete. Repair and resale costs exceeded profit. The offer was nothing. Ask yourself this: have you ever counted past price as present value? Technology ages fast. Pawnshops don't buy history. They buy usefulness. Fact 11. The antique typewriter. An elderly man walked into a pawn shop in rural Pennsylvania carrying a heavy metal typewriter wrapped in a towel. He explained that it once belonged to his father and believed it was antique enough to be valuable. The machine looked impressive: solid steel, real keys, undeniable weight. The pawnshop owner checked the model number and manufacturing year. It wasn't rare. Millions were made. Collectors already had them. Online resale prices barely covered shipping. The offer was $10, mostly for scrap value. The man hesitated, clearly offended. Ask yourself this: have you ever assumed old automatically means valuable? The typewriter had history. Unfortunately, pawnshops don't trade in family timelines. They trade in demand. Fact 12. The box of loose gemstones. A nervous man entered a pawn shop in Phoenix with a small plastic container filled with loose gemstones. He said he bought them years ago as an investment and expected a serious offer. The stones looked colorful and carefully stored. The pawnshop owner examined them under a loupe and asked for certification. There was none. Without verified grading, the stones were effectively decorative glass. The resale risk was too high. The offer was zero. Ask yourself this: have you ever trusted a purchase just because it came with confidence? The stones sparkled. Unfortunately, pawnshops don't buy possibilities. They buy certainty. Fact 13. The high-end camera with a dead sensor. A freelance photographer brought a professional camera into a pawn shop in Seattle, explaining it originally cost thousands and was almost perfect. The pawn shop owner tested it and noticed sensor damage, barely visible but fatal for resale. Repair costs exceeded market value. The offer was nothing. The photographer argued about what the camera used to produce. Ask yourself this: have you ever priced an object based on what it once did? Pawn shops don't invest in potential, they invest in resale. Fact 14. The collection of Funko Pops. A college student walked into a pawn shop near campus carrying a tote bag full of boxed Funko Pop figures. He explained they were collectibles and showed photos of online listings. The pawn shop owner checked actual sold prices, not asking prices. Most figures were common. Oversupply killed demand. The offer was minimal. Ask yourself this: have you ever confused popularity with scarcity? Pawn shops don't speculate on fandom, they price liquidation. Fact 15. The wedding dress. A woman entered a pawn shop in a small Texas town carrying a preserved wedding dress in a garment bag. She said it was expensive, worn once, and in perfect condition. The pawn shop owner didn't even open the bag. He explained there was no resale market. Sizes vary, styles date instantly. Emotional value doesn't transfer. The offer was zero. Ask yourself this: have you ever assumed a major life moment adds monetary value? The dress mattered deeply. Unfortunately, pawn shops don't buy memories. They buy objects someone else wants to own. Fact 16. The box of old coins. A man walked into a pawn shop in Arizona carrying a small wooden box filled with old coins. He explained they were collected by his grandfather and believed age alone made them valuable. The coins looked worn, mismatched, and unsorted. The pawn shop owner examined a few, checking dates and mint marks. Most were common circulation coins with heavy wear. None were rare. None were graded. Melt value was minimal. The offer reflected that. The man looked confused, then defensive. Ask yourself this: have you ever assumed age equals scarcity? The coins had history. Unfortunately, pawn shops don't buy family traditions. They buy rarity, condition, and demand. Fact 17. The limited edition sneakers. A young reseller entered a pawn shop in Atlanta carrying a pair of sneakers still in the box. He insisted they were limited edition and showed screenshots of high online prices. The pawn shop owner checked recent completed sales instead of listings. Demand had cooled. Sizes were wrong. Fakes flooded the market. The resale window had already closed. The offer was far lower than expected. Ask yourself this: have you ever mistaken hype for lasting value? The sneakers were real. The moment wasn't. Pawn shops don't gamble on trends. They price what moves today. Fact 18. The broken musical instrument. A struggling musician brought a guitar into a pawn shop in Nashville, explaining it was vintage and only needed minor work. The pawn shop owner inspected the neck and found structural damage. Repair costs exceeded resale value. The offer was zero. The musician talked about songs written on it and gigs played. Ask yourself this: have you ever expected emotional mileage to translate into money? The guitar mattered. Unfortunately, pawn shops don't buy creative history. They buy playable instruments. Fact 19. The old comic book collection. A man entered a pawn shop in New Jersey with a stack of old comic books in plastic sleeves. He believed age alone made them collectibles. The pawn shop owner checked issue numbers and condition. Creases, yellowing, and common print runs destroyed value. Only mint condition issues mattered. The offer reflected bulk paper pricing. Ask yourself this: have you ever kept something assuming it would be worth something someday? Pawn shops don't price nostalgia. They price condition. Fact 20. The home gym equipment. A fitness enthusiast walked into a pawn shop in Colorado with bulky home gym equipment. He explained it was expensive and barely used. The pawn shop owner measured space requirements and resale demand. Shipping and storage costs outweighed profit. The offer was zero. Ask yourself this: have you ever confused purchase price with resale value? The equipment worked fine. The market didn't care. Pawn shops don't buy effort. They buy liquidity. Fact 21. The old laptop with personal files. A man in his early 30s walked into a pawn shop in downtown Chicago, carrying an old laptop in a backpack. He said it still worked and was loaded with useful software. The pawn shop owner turned it on and immediately stopped. The hard drive was full of personal files, passwords, and photos. Wiping it would take time and liability. The model itself was outdated and sold cheaply online. After costs, there was no margin. The offer was zero. The man looked surprised, then embarrassed. Ask yourself this: have you ever assumed usefulness to you equals value to others? The laptop functioned. Unfortunately, pawn shops don't buy responsibility. They buy clean, resellable assets. Fact 22. The custom-made jewelry piece. A woman entered a pawn shop in suburban New Jersey with a custom-made necklace. She explained it was designed specifically for her and cost a small fortune. The piece was unique, intricate, and unmistakably personal. The pawn shop owner tested the metal and stones, then explained that custom design adds no resale value. In fact, it reduces it. Buyers want standard styles they can recognize instantly. The offer was based only on melt value. Ask yourself this: have you ever paid extra for uniqueness and expected the market to care later? The necklace was special. Unfortunately, pawn shops don't resell identity. They resell materials. Fact 23. The vintage VHS collection. A collector walked into a pawn shop in a small California town, carrying boxes of VHS tapes. He said they were vintage, unopened, and making a comeback. The pawn shop owner checked titles and condition. Most were common releases. Streaming killed demand long ago. Storage alone would cost more than resale. The offer was zero. Ask yourself this: have you ever confused nostalgia cycles with real markets? The tapes were old, the buyers were gone. Pawn shops don't bet on comebacks. They bet on cash flow. Fact 24. The framed inspirational art. A man walked into a pawn shop in Florida with a large framed piece of inspirational art. He explained it once hung in his office and inspired him daily. The pawn shop owner checked resale listings. Taste is subjective. Inspirational quotes don't age well. Shipping costs erased profit. The offer was zero. Ask yourself this: have you ever assumed something meaningful to you must matter to someone else? The art had impact. Unfortunately, pawn shops don't price motivation. They price demand. Fact 25. The old baby crib. A young couple brought an old baby crib into a pawn shop in Ohio. They said it was solid wood and barely used. The pawn shop owner explained safety regulations had changed. Older cribs couldn't legally be resold. The offer was zero. Ask yourself this: have you ever assumed still usable means still sellable? The crib wasn't broken. The rules changed. Pawn shops don't fight regulations. They follow them. Fact 26. The old hard drive full of data. A nervous man walked into a pawn shop in San Diego holding an external hard drive. He explained it contained years of work, old projects, and valuable data. In his mind, storage equaled value. The pawn shop owner asked a simple question: who would buy someone else's files? The drive itself was outdated, low capacity by modern standards, and risky to resell due to privacy concerns. Wiping it would take time. Liability would be high. The resale price wouldn't cover the hassle. The offer was zero. Ask yourself this: have you ever assumed information automatically has monetary value? The data mattered deeply to him. Unfortunately, pawn shops don't buy memories, backups, or personal history. They buy hardware someone else can safely resell. Fact 27. The old luxury watch without proof. A man in a button-down shirt entered a pawn shop in New York carrying a luxury-looking watch. He said it was expensive when purchased and kept in good condition. The watch was heavy, shiny, and convincing. The pawn shop owner examined it closely and asked for papers. There were none. Without authentication, resale risks skyrocketed. Even if real, buyers wouldn't pay market price without proof. The offer reflected scrap value only. The man looked offended. Ask yourself this: have you ever assumed appearance equals credibility? The watch looked valuable. Unfortunately, pawn shops don't trade in confidence. They trade in verification. Fact 28. The old printer with new ink. A man walked into a pawn shop in suburban Illinois carrying a bulky home printer. He explained it worked fine and even included new ink cartridges. The pawn shop owner checked the model and resale demand. New printers sold cheaply online. Ink compatibility was outdated. Storage and testing costs erased profit. The offer was zero. Ask yourself this: have you ever assumed functionality guarantees resale? The printer still worked. The market had already moved on. Pawn shops don't reward maintenance. They reward demand. Fact 29. The box of old DVDs. A collector entered a pawn shop in Oregon carrying a large box of DVDs. He said they were original releases and well cared for. The pawn shop owner checked titles and resale prices. Most were common. Streaming killed demand. Shelf space mattered more than nostalgia. The offer was minimal. Ask yourself this: have you ever confused quantity with value? The collection was complete. Unfortunately, pawn shops don't buy libraries. They buy liquidity. Fact 30. The custom gaming PC. A young man brought a custom-built gaming PC into a pawn shop in Nevada. He explained the parts were high-end and the build was carefully optimized. The pawn shop owner checked specs and resale risk. Custom systems lack standardized value. Repairs and returns are costly. Buyers prefer branded machines. The offer was far lower than expected. Ask yourself this: have you ever assumed personal optimization increases resale value? The PC was powerful. Unfortunately, pawn shops don't buy passion projects. They buy predictable inventory. Fact 31. The box of old medals. A retired man walked into a pawn shop in rural Kentucky carrying a small box filled with military medals. He spoke carefully, explaining what each medal represented and when it was earned. To him, they symbolized sacrifice and service. The pawn shop owner listened respectfully, then examined the medals. They were common issue, widely available, and easily reproduced. Without documentation or rarity, resale demand was almost non-existent. The offer reflected only the metal content. The man hesitated, clearly hurt. Ask yourself this: have you ever believed honor automatically converts into market value? The metals mattered deeply. Unfortunately, pawn shops don't buy recognition. They buy scarcity someone else is willing to pay for. Fact 32. The signed book by a famous author. A man entered a pawn shop in Boston holding a hardcover book signed by an author he insisted was famous. He explained he attended a reading years ago and kept it in perfect condition. The pawn shop owner asked one question: famous to whom? Without broad recognition or authentication, the signature added no value. Unsigned copies sold cheaply online. The offer was zero. Ask yourself this: have you ever assumed personal admiration creates resale demand? The book inspired him. Unfortunately, pawn shops don't monetize fandom. They monetize consensus. Fact 33. The old sewing machine. A woman walked into a pawn shop in Missouri with a heavy sewing machine inherited from her grandmother. She believed its age and durability made it valuable. The pawn shop owner checked the brand and model. It was mass-produced and difficult to repair. Shipping costs alone would exceed resale value. The offer was minimal. Ask yourself this: have you ever assumed they don't make them like this anymore means people want them now? The machine still worked. Unfortunately, pawn shops don't buy durability. They buy turnover. Fact 34. The box of collectible plates. A man entered a pawn shop in Indiana carrying box collectible plates. He explained they were limited editions and never displayed. The pawn shop owner checked resale listings. Demand had collapsed years ago. Collectors moved on. The offer was zero. Ask yourself this: have you ever trusted marketing language longer than the market itself? The plates were pristine. Unfortunately, pawn shops don't buy promises printed decades ago. They buy active demand. Fact 35. The old office chair. A small business owner brought a high-end office chair into a pawn shop in Arizona. He explained it was expensive, ergonomic, and barely used. The pawnshop owner checked condition and resale demand. Office furniture depreciates fast. Transportation costs erased margin. The offer was 0. Ask yourself this. Have you ever assumed comfort translates into resale value? The chair supported him for years. Unfortunately, pawnshops don't buy support. They buy items that move. Fact 36. The old suit. From a big career moment, a middle-aged man walked into a pawnshop in downtown Denver carrying a carefully folded suit in a garment bag. He explained it was custom-tailored and worn during an important career milestone. To him, it symbolized success. The pawnshop owner inspected the fabric and size. Custom suits are hard to resell. Styles date quickly. Fit matters more than quality. Dry cleaning alone would cut into profit. The offer was 0. Ask yourself this. Have you ever believed success leaves resale value behind? The suit mattered to his story. Unfortunately, pawnshops don't buy achievements. They buy items that fit someone else's body and budget. Fact 37. The old drone with missing parts. A young man entered a pawnshop in Arizona holding a drone in its original case. He said it flew most of the time and only needed a replacement battery. The pawnshop owner checked the contents. Missing propellers, outdated firmware, no charger. Repair costs exceeded resale value. The offer was nothing. Ask yourself this. Have you ever assumed almost complete still counts? The drone once felt futuristic. Unfortunately, pawnshops don't buy projects. They buy finished products ready to move. Fact 38. The box of old awards and certificates. A former sales manager walked into a pawnshop in New Jersey carrying framed awards and certificates. He explained they proved years of top performance. The pawnshop owner glanced briefly. Corporate awards have no resale market. Names are personal. Companies change. The offer was 0. Ask yourself this. Have you ever assumed recognition creates liquidity? The awards validated his career. Unfortunately, pawnshops don't buy validation. They buy items someone else wants to own. Fact 39. The vintage stereo system. A man brought a large vintage stereo system into a pawnshop in Michigan. He explained it was high-end in its day and sounded incredible. The pawnshop owner tested it. The system worked, but parts were obsolete and shipping was expensive. Demand was niche. The offer was minimal. Ask yourself this. Have you ever believed "they don't make them like this anymore" guarantees value? The stereo was impressive. Unfortunately, pawnshops don't buy nostalgia. They buy turnover. Fact 40. The old business sign. A small business owner walked into a pawnshop in Louisiana carrying an old storefront sign with his company's name on it. He said it was professionally made and cost a lot. The pawnshop owner shook his head. Custom signage has 0 resale value. Names don't transfer. Branding expires instantly outside its context. The offer was 0. Ask yourself this. Have you ever assumed your brand means something to strangers? The sign represented years of effort. Unfortunately, pawnshops don't buy identity. They buy generic demand. Fact 41. The old yearbook collection. A man walked into a pawnshop in upstate New York carrying several high school yearbooks from the 1990s. He explained they were rare because they were old and in good condition. The pawnshop owner flipped through them briefly. Names were unfamiliar. Faces meant nothing. Schools change. Interest doesn't travel. There was no resale market beyond the people who lived those years. The offer was 0. Ask yourself this. Have you ever assumed shared memories automatically have shared value? The yearbooks preserved moments. Unfortunately, pawnshops don't buy other people's nostalgia. They buy objects strangers want. Fact 42. The collector action figures. A man entered a pawnshop in Southern California with boxed action figures he kept sealed for decades. He said he saved them specifically for resale. The pawnshop owner checked demand and condition. Mass production killed scarcity. Boxes showed wear. Online prices were inflated by hope. not sales. The offer was minimal. Ask yourself this: have you ever waited years for value that never arrived? The figures were preserved perfectly. Unfortunately, pawn shops don't reward patience. They reward demand that actually exists. Fact 43. The old diploma and framed degrees. A former professional walked into a pawn shop in Virginia carrying framed diplomas and certificates. He explained they represented years of education and cost a lot to earn. The pawn shop owner didn't inspect them. Degrees are personal, non-transferable, and worthless on resale. The offer was zero. Ask yourself this: have you ever assumed effort itself has resale value? The education mattered deeply. Unfortunately, pawn shops don't buy credentials. They buy objects that can change owners. Fact 44. The broken jewelry music box. A woman brought a decorative jewelry music box into a pawn shop in Utah. She said it was antique and sentimental. The music mechanism didn't work. Repairs would cost more than resale. Decorative value alone wasn't enough. The offer was zero. Ask yourself this: have you ever believed fixable equals valuable? The box once mattered. Unfortunately, pawn shops don't buy restoration dreams. They buy finished goods. Fact 45. The box of old love letters. A man walked into a pawn shop in Oregon carrying a box of handwritten love letters. He said they were old and beautifully written. The pawn shop owner didn't open them. Personal letters have no resale value. Privacy risk alone made them unsellable. The offer was zero. Ask yourself this: have you ever mistaken intimacy for worth? The letters captured a relationship. Unfortunately, pawn shops don't buy feelings. They buy things. None of these people walked into a pawn shop thinking they were doing something dumb. They walked in thinking they were being reasonable. Each item came with logic. It was old. It was expensive once. It mattered. It was rare to them. And every time, reality answered the same way. Quietly, politely, without emotion. Pawn shops don't argue. They don't negotiate stories. They don't care how hard something was earned, how long it was kept, or why it feels important. They ask one question only: would someone else actually pay for this today? Most of the time, the answer is no. What keeps repeating here isn't stupidity. It's a gap between personal value and market value, between effort and demand, between memory and money. And that gap is uncomfortable because everyone has it. That drawer, that box, that thing you keep just in case. Pawn shops don't expose bad people. They expose bad assumptions. They are where confidence meets pricing, and pricing doesn't care how sincere you are. If there's a lesson here, it's not about pawn shops at all. It's about how often we confuse meaning with worth until someone puts a number on it. And most of the time, that number is zero. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Most of these items weren't stupid. They were honest. They represented time, effort, money, love, ambition, identity. And that's exactly why people believed they had value. But the market doesn't see effort. It doesn't see intention. It doesn't see the years behind an object. It only sees one thing. Can this move today? Pawn shops aren't cruel. They're just honest in a way we're not used to. They don't argue with your past. They don't validate your story. They don't care how badly you need it to be worth something. They answer with a number or silence. And that's why this hurts to watch. Because everyone owns something they think has value. Something they keep just in case. Something that feels too important to throw away. Until reality asks for proof. Not sentiment. Not memories. Not hope. Proof that someone else wants it enough to pay. So the real question isn't, why would anyone bring this to a pawn shop? It's this. What are you holding on to right now that only feels valuable because no one has priced it yet? Because the moment something faces the market, it stops being about you. And that's when you find out what it's actually worth. This was the Absurdist Files, where objects don't lie, value doesn't care, and reality always names its price.